Nikole Hannah-Jones is an outstanding writing with the New York Magazine, a great writer. Yes, here for Nikole Hannah-Jones, New York Times Magazine. Give her a hand.
What we're going to do is moderate a conversation so that we can understand the implications of Brown v. Board of Education. No one has fought harder in this and for a greater period of time than Reverend Jesse Jackson, right? So we'd like to ask questions of Reverend Jackson as well. And we're going to bring on Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary, because we need to have all of these perspectives as we find out about Brown versus Board of Education and how it's impacted us. Reverend Jackson, could you go to the... Okay, well, there we go. How about that? First of all, could you first explain what is the Brown v. Board of Education? Many people feel that it's an economic decision. Some people have we've looked at it through a racial lens. What is it?
Right, so Brown v. Board of Education is the Supreme Court ruling that outlaws school segregation. It rules that prior to that, the Supreme Court said that segregation was okay as long as separate schools for black children were made equal. But of course, I don't have to tell anyone in this room that that was never the case, that segregated schools for black children were never equal. And the NAACP challenged segregation before the Supreme Court, and a unanimous ruling of 9 judges said that segregation could no longer be the law of the land. Many people think that Brown v. Board of Education was about resources, but Brown v. Board of Education was really about racial caste. It was arguing that if you separate black children, you are stigmatizing black children, you are demeaning black children, you're denying them full access to their citizenship. So when we think about the Supreme Court ruling in Brown, that then lays the foundation for black people to challenge segregation in every other aspect of life. So without Brown, you wouldn't have had the 64 Civil Rights Act, you wouldn't have had the 68 Civil Rights Act, you wouldn't have had the challenges in the Montgomery bus boycott that overturned segregated seating on buses. And so Brown really sets that stage for the end of legal apartheid across all of American life.
When we look at Brown today, okay, that was 6.5 decades ago. Where are we today as they're talking about the resegregation of schools? Is that happening? Is Brown null and void? Talk to us.
So I would clearly not argue that Brown is null and void, but Brown has never really been enforced outside of the South. So one could look in any school in Chicago and see that black children and Latino children are still extremely segregated in northern cities all across the country. We never had much political will to enforce Brown v. Board outside of the South, and we've actually seen schools that were desegregated starting to resegregate. So when you look at the data now, black children are about as segregated as they were in the 1970s, so we've gone back in time.
You continue to talk about outside of the South. I've heard you say that a couple of times. What do you mean? Was school segregation a problem in the North or not? Because many people in the North feel that they're so enlightened, it didn't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, anybody in this room who migrated from the South to the North knows that the North was not a promised land for black people. And there was a great deal of segregation. And in fact, the city of Chicago schools were placed under a desegregation order as well, as were schools in New York, as were schools in Detroit, as were schools in Philadelphia. So segregation in the North was not by law, but it was still being implemented by official policy. So school board members were assigning black children to black schools, white children to white schools, allowing white children to flee schools that were designated as black. And again, one can look across the city today and see that the white children who remain in Chicago public schools are concentrated in a very small number of high-performing schools, and black and brown children are concentrated in a large number of low-performing schools.
So do you think that the distinction, or should I say the line between the highly selective public schools and the neighborhood schools, how does that impact Brown, or how did Brown impact it?
I mean, Brown did not have a great deal of impact in Chicago, because what happened was when places like Chicago were placed under court order, white people simply fled the public schools. And in the North, as you know, you can just move a couple miles across an invisible municipal barrier line to a white suburb with white schools, and you didn't have to worry about desegregation. So while Brown outlawed legal segregation, you had to actually force integration to undo that segregation, and that's just never happened up here. Name your Democratic white mayor of Chicago, and none of them were advocates for school integration, and most of them were not advocates for housing integration.
Well, let's look at what happened on the federal level, because of course we saw the fight shift to the U.S. House of Representatives and most particularly the U.S. Senate in the mid-'70s, and we saw a showdown. In fact, many would argue that the first black senator elected from the state of Massachusetts, Edward Brooke, lost his seat because of his stance on pushing for busing, which is, he said, this is at the heart of Brown v. Board of Education. And interestingly enough, one of our presidential candidates who ran, Joe Biden ran on busing, he said, look, we need to desegregate the schools, but he got to the Senate and turned away because of his neighborhood. Talk to us.
Right, so there was a tremendous amount of white backlash to Brown v. Board. Initially, that backlash was in the South because white Northerners thought that Brown only applied to the South. They didn't think that they were segregating children up here. And once Brown came to the North, the way that they had to integrate schools in the North, because housing segregation was so bad, was by busing kids out of their neighborhoods, because neighborhood schools reflected the racial segregation of the neighborhoods. That's when you saw white Northern support for school desegregation really disappear. And they used busing really as the red herring. It wasn't really about busing, as they used to say in the 70s, it ain't the bus, it's us. So it wasn't about that busing was a problem, it was about who was being bused into white schools. So Joe Biden, who's the presidential candidate that you were speaking about, actually just recently came out that behind the scenes he was working with white segregationists. He was working with Senator Eastland, who was one of the most openly racist members of the Senate at that time, behind the scenes to stop busing, which really meant that he was working to end efforts to desegregate schools.
How should we interpret that? That was 40 years ago. What about in the lens, through the 2019 lens?
Well, he has not disavowed his opposition to busing for desegregation. And in fact, when he's been asked about it recently, he still says that he believes that was the right thing to do. And one can look at the Obama administration policies around education and see that they were not doing any efforts really to help integrate schools under Obama, and instead really led to a larger privatization of public schools, which we've also seen happen in Chicago with the proliferation of charter schools.
In fact, that really kicked off here in Chicago. Let me bring in Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary, because Nikole, he is from Baltimore, which has become notorious for segregated schools and for the schools, Congressman Bobby Rush, that have been undercapitalized, for want of another term. They have not gotten their resources. Reverend Dr. Yeary?
Well, I think it's important to put Brown in the historical context that takes us all the way back to the aftermath of the Civil War. When the 14th Amendment was ratified, it put two legal principles, and applied them to the states. One was due process, and the other was equal protection. Those two provisions then made states accountable for how they managed the inclusion of former slaves into the post-slavery economy. The immediate response was Southern states began to push back. We know that there are a number of cases post the end of the Civil War, and probably the most important Civil Rights Act in our history is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which said explicitly that whites and blacks were absolutely equal in all areas of life. It was unequivocal. What we then saw was a gradual erosion, an intentional pushback against the notion of white superiority, not just in the South, but in the nation. And so when Plessy v. Ferguson comes up, it actually institutionalizes what had been the erosion in the civil rights cases that came before the courts, that began to just chip away at the impact of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So when Separate but Equal comes along, based on the Plessy case, remember the Plessy case is in Louisiana on a train where Homer Plessy, a black guy who could pass, bought a first-class ticket, paid for his ticket, gave the conductor his ticket, and then disclosed, hey, oh, by the way, I'm black, at which point he was forced off of the train, even though he resisted and then sued in court. That's when the court came up with this thing called separate but equal. right? That you could keep the races separate as long as the facilities were for the most part equal. And we know that separate and equal was a design, but it was not a practice. And so here's what we began to see. States actually had laws forbidding the educating of black students and white students together. It was state law. States had intentional practices that said you would not, there was no funding requirement in terms of equal dollars. And so when we get to Brown, there are a couple of issues. We had gone through the desegregation of higher education and graduate schools. University of Maryland, where I just graduated from on yesterday, had to be forced to allow black people to go to law school. We got to remember that. The University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill was forced to integrate in 1951 after McKissick v. Carmichael. And so we had a number of cases, test cases, that put Brown in position to then change the public schooling requirement across the country. And then what you end up with in Brown is a resistance to the 1954 decision that then leads to a second Brown decision the next year, where the Supreme Court then mandates that you must desegregate with all deliberate speed, because there was an intentional slowing down. We see it, right? They go slow. When they don't want to do it, they come up with all kinds of excuses about why they can't implement what the court has said. And now what we've seen with the change in the attitude around race in the country and the stacking of the courts is that really the impact of equal and public accommodations across the board, it wasn't just about schools, it was about everything that tied to our lives. We're now looking at the absolute assault on Brown v. Board, because that's been the pushback of this doctrine of white supremacy that they've tried to undo Brown since Brown was passed, the anniversary just having been marked yesterday.
Nikole, I mean, with your investigative work with the New York Times, is the Brown decision important today, particularly as we move into 2020? You know, whenever you do talk radio, which I do, whenever you do television, which I do, the thing that gets black people and people of color and poor people most animated, middle-class people, the education of their children, right? Because education is the path upward for us. Should it, or is it an issue in 2020?
Yes, I think it is a foundational issue in 2020. You asked about Baltimore. Well, Baltimore, of course, is the birthplace of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall sues the University of Maryland because the University of Maryland denied him admission, and he had to go to Howard and get his law degree, and then he was determined to dismantle apartheid in Maryland to get his vengeance, I guess you could say. But why does Brown matter? Because you look at Baltimore schools right now. Baltimore schools are extremely segregated. There's been a great deal of white flight. When white people leave a community, they also take their tax dollars with them. And so you have children today who are sitting in schools where, if you read the conditions, it sounds like the conditions in the schools in 1953 when we were looking at black schools. Schools that don't have textbooks, schools that don't have heat, schools that don't have windows, schools that have rodents and pests. So I think there is no way we can deny that Brown still has relevance. And I think it's important to say Brown was never about saying that sitting a black child next to a white child made that black child smart. What Brown was saying was that in a country built on racial caste, you have to have white children and black children in the same building, because we've never valued black children the same. And so if you want black children to get what we assure white children get, they have to be in the same spaces together. And when we separate the most marginalized of our kids, which are poor black children, we've never seen a community that has treated those children the same as white children. And so what we see is continually we are willing to sacrifice the education of black children. As you said, from the beginning, black children were intended to be educated. Black children in many state constitutions didn't provide for public education for black children at all, including Illinois. I think we sometimes forget Illinois was actually in many parts a de jure segregated state. In Illinois, in the southern part, didn't even desegregate until after Brown v. Board of Education.
Chicago, too.
Chicago as well. I mean, Chicago is definitely considered de jure segregated, and if you go back and look, Chicago schools right after the Civil War were integrated. And then as more black people started coming up from the South, white Chicagoans then started to demand segregation and actually passed by ballot measure to segregate schools. So this is the history and the legacy. And when you look at a place like Chicago now, when a school is targeted for integration, where they're trying to take a poor black school and merge attendance zones with a wealthier white school, white parents in Chicago fight against that integration just like they did 50 years ago. So what I think we need to remember about what the Supreme Court rules in Brown is that education is one of the most important foundations of government and also of citizenship. And as long as we are depriving black children of a quality education, we are depriving them actually of their full citizenship. And I think we see that every day, that our schools are operating as designed. Our schools are designed to create a laboring class, a class that will serve. And that's largely what our children are being educated to do, not to lead, but to serve.
Nikole Hatter-Jones of the New York Times, everybody. We're so excited to have her and Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary with us today. Nikole, what would you, in the media, this is barely discussed, and it's barely written about. I think that's why it's of such tremendous import that the New York Times, America's newspaper of record, would invest in your investigation. What questions should we be asking in the mainstream media? I mean, because we have the power to write and to email. I mean, we have much more power. We can impact the general conversation far more than we know. But you, the viewer, the consumer of the media, because that's what you are, you have to get involved. What would you speak to them? Give us some media education here. What can we do to make Brown v. Board of Education and education for our children a top priority? The equal access to equal high-quality education, I have to borrow from Congressman Jesse Jackson, Jr.
I mean, the first questions that you should ask are about school funding. How much funding are high-poverty schools that serve a lot of black children receiving versus magnet schools, which serve a lot of white children? I always tell communities, request your school attendance zone maps. So school board members sit down, they draw maps, and they determine which kids will go to which schools. But they're actually as gerrymandered as electoral districts, and they're usually gerrymandered.
Say that one more time. Schools are what?
School attendance zones are as gerrymandered to produce certain results as congressional districts.
What do you mean produce certain results?
So you know that we draw congressional maps to make certain parts of a city or a state Democratic and certain parts of a city or state Republican. This is also done with school attendance zone maps, where they will draw around certain neighborhoods to ensure that certain schools serve white children and certain schools serve black children. And so when you look at the maps, they don't often make sense. They'll have little areas that aren't contiguous exactly. So in that same way, I always tell people in their communities, request these maps so that you can actually see how intentional the segregation is, but also you can challenge the maps. You can ask, why are these maps drawn to put white neighborhoods in certain schools and black neighborhoods in other schools? And the other big thing, of course, is the qualifications of the teaching staff that are often in black schools. They often have very high teacher turnover. They have teachers who are not certified to teach in the subjects that they're teaching our kids. And these are the way that you start to see these inequalities reproduced is long-term teacher vacancies. So the schools that I'm in, a lot of times, you can have a math class, you can have a science class where there's not a certified teacher for an entire year. How can our children compete when they don't have certified teachers in their classrooms? This does not happen in white schools. I don't know a wealthy white school that can go a year without a math teacher. But I know regularly poor black schools where there are no teachers even in the classrooms at all. There could be anyone in here could walk off the street and become a substitute teacher and sit and babysit kids. And the kids know that they're not learning. They know that they're not being taught. And I think those are the things that I empower community members to do, is we have to go into those schools and actually see what is happening behind the closed doors, because our children are seeing it. And then when they stop focusing so much on their education, we blame them. But why would I take my education seriously if adults don't take it seriously enough to give me a teacher in my classroom or a textbook to learn from?
Reverend Dr. Yeary, we're not hearing that in 2020. That's not top of line.
Well, and it needs to be on the table, right? Because there's the de facto. What we're hearing is that's de facto segregation, right? It's within the rules of the policy making that produces an outcome that affirms certain interests. So white interests have a particular value to the exclusion of all others. We actually have the Stout case that's going through the courts right now, where you have the desire to remove from the county school district to set up their own school district that would be majority white, because it says that we have the right to decide how we're going to use public dollars to affirm certain interests. And if it's going to cause, the association with black folks, not just that you get to be more poor or somehow or other you get to be less than, right? There's some sort of accommodation that goes with it. We never affirm the normalcy of black genius and decide that we want to affirm it just that way. And so our challenge is in 2020 is we've got to put education and more importantly, the pushback against white supremacy that's been institutionalized by constitutional behavior. Baltimore was the home of redlining. It was the first city to pass a redlining law upon which other redlining statutes and ordinances were fashioned. Baltimore, white flight out of the heart of Baltimore City is what we now call the Jones Falls Expressway, I-83. It'll take you from the inner harbor to the outer country as quickly as you can get. And on both sides, there's disruption of what were otherwise contiguous, healthy neighborhoods. The notion of where are the jobs going. So here's what you're beginning to see is as these communities are shifting, and I'm glad you raised the point about construction of schools. Prior to the current construction plan of schools in Baltimore City, there had not been a new school built in Baltimore City in over 40 years before the legislation came out of the General Assembly a few years ago. And so we're beginning to see absolute denial. You're seeing kind of political indifference to be able to kind of push back. And so when we look at these things, we got to look at a number of these markers. What does it mean that you have now federal judges who are unqualified and don't even know history, much less the law, actually making the determinations and reshaping the constitutional obligations? We got to keep that on the table, and we've got to make it a high issue in 2020.
Absolutely,
just
because
add
yes,
something really
the
quickly?
final minute belongs to you.
I would ask your viewers to think about how many of the presidential candidates are talking about education. What have you heard from them about this issue? Almost nothing. And that tells you our values. Jobs are important, but who works the jobs if our children aren't educated? So I think we need to spend a lot more time pressing our politicians and our candidates running for president. What do they plan to do around the unequal educational facilities and instruction and opportunities that our children have? Because we can't compete for jobs if we don't have an education to get those jobs.
The story, the story perverse. A lot of logical as I said, well, blacks don't have to sit beside whites getting education. Nikole brother has 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. He teaches 5 languages. Children at Notre Dame come there in the summertime and compare it to our children. So it's not about sitting next to whites, it's sitting next to resources. Am I right about that?
That's right. The resource question is a big one, right? Because there's a certain value proposition. We assume that we can underfund schools of color and overfund white schools. So when we start looking at the resource question, remember one of the rules were you couldn't let white students and black students use the same textbooks, as if somehow the content would get contaminated if you transferred the information. And so we've got to go back and raise the moral issue. This is a moral issue in 2020, and we've got to make it a high priority.
It seems to me critical that whole proposition is that we must revive our fierce turning to have one set of rules. One set of rules in football, basketball, baseball, but not for education. So we must fight for one set of rules. We must learn to read, write, count, and compute. There's nothing we cannot do. We've never lost a battle that we fought, never won a battle unless we fought. It's fight back time for education. Fight back time. Put your hands together. Say, I am somebody. I am somebody. My mind is a pearl. I can learn anything in the world. My mind is a pearl. I can do anything in the world. Stop the violence. Let's say, give a big hand for Dr. Nikole and Hannah Jones. Dr. Todd, Yeary, give him a big hand.